I want you to think about the change in your pocket. If you don't have any money in your pocket, it's all right, just pretend that you do. Now, this change in your pocket is all the money you have in the world, and you can only buy one of these things with it. You can either buy a pen and a notebook, or you can spend all the money you have in the world on a sandwich. What would you choose? Now, this may seem like a bizarre question to some, but years ago, I found myself faced with this question. Do I buy a notebook and a pen, or do I buy lunch with all the money I have in the world? See, I was born in a small, beautiful town in what is now South Sudan. But up until 2011, South Sudan was in a long, brutal civil war, fighting for autonomy from the north. Now, when the fighting reached our town, my brother and I fled our home on foot, alone. Our parents had left to find food for the family days before. We walked for a week before arriving at a refugee camp in Ethiopia. I was 9 and he was 11. We walked mostly at night because it was a lot safer than walking during the day. When the sun rises, my brother and I would find shelter, and sometimes a good Samaritan along the way would invite us to wait at their home until it was safe to travel. The journey was long and harsh, but we made it to the camp safe. I remember our very first night at the camp. It was so calm and peaceful. People were laughing and sharing stories. It was so strange in that I almost forgotten what peace felt like. After a couple of weeks, we were taken to the UN registration office where we were registered as newly arrived refugees. We were given some food, blankets, cooking wares, and some school supplies. We ended up spending 6 years in that refugee camp, completely dependent on the UN. The first time I ever set foot in a classroom was because the UN, UNICEF, and other children advocacy organizations gave us hope by building a school and employing teachers. I remember my very first book bag had UNICEF written all over it in big white letters. I was so happy to be learning and playing with children my age. And in some way, the UN gave us hope in a place where hope and optimism was in short supply. The UN also ensured that we didn't starve, and so they gave us food every month, but unfortunately, this food that we got each month just wasn't enough to last us the whole 30 days. It never made it past 15 days, and so not having enough food meant we had to survive somehow. And so each day, my brothers and I would gather firewoods to sell and trade for active food. During these days, school was not a priority. It was during these days that I made a decision to spend my last change on food rather than school supplies. After a rigorous process, the UN and the US worked to get us resettled in the United States. In 2006, we were told that we would be going to a place called Omaha, Nebraska. Omaha, Nebraska welcomed us with a bunch of snow and the coldest night of our lives. It was not the America we imagined. But for the very first time in my life, I was hopeful for the future. I was 15 at the time, so they told me that even though I couldn't read, write, or speak English, 9th grade was where people my age were and where I should begin. And with the help of some amazing ESL teachers in Omaha South High, I learned to read, write, and speak English. As a kid in that refugee camp, I wanted to work for the UN so much, for obvious reasons. I was so inspired by the work the UN was doing at the camp. But I didn't see how such a dream was possible in a refugee camp. I knew education was a tool, a way to get there, but my circumstances did not allow me to prioritize education. So when I came to the US, that dream became possible. But I knew that I had to work really hard. I knew that I had to work twice as hard to make up what I missed, to catch up with my peers, and that's exactly what I did. As a freshman in high school, I learned to read, write, and speak English. After I graduated high school, I got a scholarship to college right here at UNO. And after college, I got into law school and went to University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Now, this has been a great, great dream of mine, to work for the UN. And with some super amazing law professor this past summer, my life came full circle. I was offered a legal internship at the United Nations headquarters in New York, where I spent 3 months doing things I was only dreaming about as a kid in that refugee camp. I was helping the organization that saved my life and my brother's years ago, and in some small way, I like to think that my work had an impact this summer. I like to think that what I did this summer helped another child running for his or her life somewhere on the globe. But working for the UN this summer only exposed me to many great challenges that the UN is still fighting to overcome around the world. You see, the UN is a world first responder when a crisis hit. If the UN didn't exist when the crisis hit my town years ago, I wouldn't be here today. And this is true for millions of families around the world. The UN incredible humanitarian workers provide supplies that you may immediately think are important when a crisis hit. They provide dignity kits and supplies for women who are about to give birth but can't find a clinic anywhere. They advocate for children in war zone and conflict, making sure kids such as I was can still go to school as refugees. And they tapped into innovation to improve livelihood. In one refugee camp in Jordan, the UN uses cutting-edge iris scan technology to make food delivery easier, and has implemented the largest solar plant in any refugee camp, creating better outcome for people and the planet. And the US support is absolutely critical to all of this work. Less than 2% of federal budget goes toward the UN mission. That's $1.86 per American per year. The fact still remains, the UN simply doesn't have the resources or funding to meet the needs of people around the world. I watched a documentary recently where this guy was talking about how when we go to the stars, when we colonize Mars, that we must go as one. That is, we must not go as Americans, Russians, Chinese, or even South Sudanese. That we must go as human beings. That we must explore the galaxy as one race, the human race. As a space nerd and someone who believes in humanity's extraordinary capacity for unity in the face of great challenges, this gives me hope, and it also reminds me of how far we have to go on this journey. Because today, on this planet, not Mars, today on this planet, over 800 million of our fellow human beings are food insecure, and I was one of them just 12 years ago. Think about that for a minute. Over 800 million people don't know where they will get their next meal. And as someone who's lived that life, I can tell you right now that there are children in refugee camps right now who are choosing to spend all day working instead of going to school. I promise you, there are children in refugee camps right now who are making the same decision I made years ago. They're choosing to spend their last change on food rather than school supplies. And their children being forced into harm groups and forced to do inhumane things because that's the only way they could survive. And the UN is often the only hope and stability for those escaping violence. And working at the UN exposed me to these challenges, and seeing people from every part of our world come together to work to advance the interests of humanity was a real inspiration to what's possible when we all come together. I want you to think about what it means to be human. I challenge you to think about what it means to be a refugee. Because based on my experience and what I've experienced, to be a refugee is to be human at its fundamental core. Because it's about struggle, it's about survival. One of my favorite human is a stranger who I've never met before and only met that one day and never saw again. One day, in high school, my car ran out of gas in the middle of the street on my way to school. Halfway to school, the car just stopped, and no matter what I did, it just would not move. And out of the many cars that passed me that day, this small, middle-aged white lady parked right behind me. She got out of her car, and without asking any question, she said, "You drive, I'll push." After we finally got the car out of the street, she asked, "What happened?" I said, "Well, I didn't have any money to put gas in my car this morning, and I didn't really want to miss school. So I just decided to drive and hope that I would at least make it to school before the car completely ran out of gas." She ran back into her car, grabbed her wallet, and handed me $6. What she did for me that day has and will always stay with me, because she fundamentally changed the way in which I see the world. In some way, she made me become a better human being. She inspired me to become a better person, because today I can't see a car that stops in the middle of the street or highway without thinking about what she did for me that day, or without being compelled to help. We have an obligation to help our fellow human beings. My life is substantially better today because of people like those strangers years ago who let us into their homes until it was safe to travel. My entire world is completely different today because of people such as this stranger who invested her time and money to make sure that I get to school and chase my dream. Nelson Mandela once said that as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest. We must all be in this together, and I think that's essentially what it means to be human. And I think that's what it'll take for us to create a world that we can be proud of. I think that's what it'll take for us to create a world in which we can all thrive. Thank you.